What prepares men for totalitarian domination is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience suffered in certain marginal social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses. Organized loneliness threatens to ravage the world as we know it, a world where everything seems to have come to an end. Loneliness is the common ground for terror, the essence of totalitarian government, and the preparation of its executioners and victims. Those are the words of Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism, her classic diagnosis of how Nazism and Stalinism happened and how things like them might happen again. For the German-American philosopher who famously sat in on the trials of Nazis and gave us the concept of the banality of evil, one of the key lessons from the whole mid-century catastrophe was that extraordinary acts of evil are often just committed by very ordinary people with very ordinary feelings. And one of these ordinary feelings is loneliness. For Arendt, loneliness is both something done to individuals by authoritarian regimes and also an essential condition for the rise of these regimes in the first place. Now, loneliness has been having a bit of a moment. According to people in print, on YouTube, and our feeds, we are more lonelier than ever, more disconnected than ever. In concerned discussions about technology, swiping, friendships, community, people refer to something called the loneliness epidemic. This thing that looms in the background and that everyone seems to accept is both true and a thing worth getting in a tizzy about. For political observers, loneliness seems to be one of the drivers of the rise of the right, as so much of our politics comes to be shaped by the alienated, the lonely, the online. But despite all this very concerned noise, I can't help feeling like much of the discussion is a little insufficient. More of a kind of moral panic than a serious consideration, lacking a little in politics or theory. So in this video, we're going to take a look at some problems with how people talk about loneliness at the moment, suggest some possible alternatives, and talk about how this feeling that is so kind of fundamental to the human condition is also shaped by things like class, power, and economics. I'm an Irish writer in Berlin, and this is The Politics of Loneliness. The video is mostly going to be about language, about how we talk about things and how the way that we talk discourages or encourages certain ways of thinking. Let's start with the most common framing of the loneliness problem, the loneliness epidemic. Where did this phrase come from? What does it tell us? And what does it kind of obscure? So in the early parts of the century, there had been concern amongst American media commentators about the rise of social disconnection. Most famously, we had Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, which documented a fading age of American community and warned about the future for America in a country where people were becoming more disconnected from each other and participating less in the everyday things that make society work. And Putnam used pathogenic language here. He talked about a growing anti-civic epidemic. But the story of the loneliness epidemic really starts with Dr. Vivek Murthy. He's our patient zero. So Murphy is a US physician, a former Surgeon General, and also Vice Admiral. He served the Democrats in the White House after 2015, and as Surgeon General, he tried to promote a more holistic approach to American health and well-being. And it's him that introduces the term. So in autumn 2017, Harvard Business Review published a bunch of articles on the theme of work and connecting. And Murphy contributes from these articles. And it's titled Work and the Loneliness Epidemic. The article lays out the side effects of loneliness for public health and job performance, encouraging businesses to foster better emotional being and connection in the workplace, under the logic that, quote, reducing isolation at work is good for business. After the article is published, Murphy goes on to talk to other outlets promoting this idea of the epidemic, places like NPR, Washington Post, and the term starts to gain much more traction in the culture. Murphy gives interviews in which he tries to explain the seriousness of the problem, and he pushes a very specific kind of medical public health angle. He suggests that loneliness, when regular or chronic, is linked to things like depression, anxiety, cardiovascular problems. He emphasizes the condition's particularly contagious dimension with the idea that, well, if one person is lonely, it passes on to another person, and there's a kind of viral network effect. So he's kind of setting up the legitimacy of the epidemic metaphor. He goes on to write a book to work on the topic for the World Health Organization, and when Biden replaces Trump at the White House, Murphy is back in the job as US Surgeon General. There, him and his team publish a influential report, an advisory report, Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation, which is kind of the closest thing really to an official declaration of epidemic status. The report covers in exhaustive detail the current data on increasing isolation, the poor health of social relationships in America, the various knock-on effects for physical and mental health, and suggests a laundry list of changes and recommendations that individuals and institutions can do in order to foster a more connected society. One of the specific health claims that really catches attention in the press is the idea that regular or chronic loneliness or isolation is as bad as smoking, more specifically smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And it's a catchy kind of comparison, but obviously the details are a bit murkier. So when you look into the claim, what it actually suggests is that in general, poor social relationships have an effect on mortality equivalent to other well-known high-impact health factors. So things like, say, obesity or smoking. The idea here isn't that being lonely gives you black lung. It's more that if you don't have strong social relationships in your life, you're just not likely to be around for as long. Which makes sense, apart from the sort of physical harms of lack of contact, depression, anxiety, etc. If you don't have people around you, you have less people to help take care of you, to remind you to take care of yourself, to bring you to the hospital, etc., etc. But obviously that's not quite as sexy as loneliness is the new smoking. So over the last decade or so, Murphy has become a sort of loneliness thought leader, and his work has played a key role in normalizing and legitimizing the loneliness epidemic as a lens through which we can interpret and talk about these problems. And while all this is happening, you have things like Western governments making announcements about loneliness as a public health policy concern, appointing so-called ministers for loneliness, this kind of thing. And since he's introduced the term into the culture, we now kind of see it everywhere. It's used as like a catch-all for a whole host of problems around relationships and disconnection. But the normalization of this epidemic metaphor as the default lens, the default framework through which we can understand these problems, does also come with costs. And a big one is a kind of implicit depoliticalization. So an epidemic, even though it is managed and solved or not solved through politics, through governments and government agencies, an epidemic still feels kind of natural, like a meteor or a hurricane, not specifically something that people need to be held accountable for. And this sense of like a diffused responsibility comes across in Murphy's general advisory report on the subject. So like I said, the report lists in great detail some of the causes of increased social isolation and all of the different ways that all aspects of American society can help with the problem. In the report, loneliness and isolation seem to be things that just kind of emerge everywhere all at once. They don't seem so connected to specific social relations or specific questions of power or economics. Even though the report is articulated through the mechanism of the government, through the White House, there isn't really a sense that they can meaningfully intervene in the problem. It's kind of up to everyone, everywhere, to pitch in and do their best. The report acknowledges that dealing with this problem requires changes in how public infrastructure is funded, or how schools operate, or changes to healthcare, or the pressures put on citizens by jobs and workplaces. But at no point is there a concrete suggestion of changes through law that actually might force these kinds of improvements. So just one example of this kind of naivety is when the report is outlining suggestions to social media companies for things they can do. And the report hopes that these companies can, quote, intentionally design technology that fosters healthy dialogue and relationships, including across diverse communities. This also means avoiding design features and algorithms that drive division, polarization, interpersonal conflict, and contribute to unhealthy perceptions of one's self and one's relationships. But the obvious problem here is that social media companies make their money from interpersonal conflict and division and unhealthy self-perceptions. They're not going to change these things because you ask them. You would have to force it. So as well-intentioned as the report might seem in a lot of ways, it also seems kind of wishy-washy, neglectful of how mechanisms of power and economics drive the problems that are being discussed. Okay, let's take a little detour now. So, as we've seen, this concept, this lens of the loneliness epidemic has gained widespread authority and acceptance. And this means that when people are trying to articulate something about these problems, they have this ready made tag that they can hang their specific anxieties and points onto. And so, not long after the introduction of the epidemic idea into the culture, we get its mutant offspring, the male loneliness epidemic. And this one's tricky. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I just want to talk a little bit about the discursive work that this idea is doing and how it might help and not help our approach to the problem. Okay, so let's start with our most kind of charitable interpretation of the term. The pros of sectioning off the concept in a specifically gendered way. Different studies will make different claims about how widespread loneliness or isolation is across genders. But we can make the general assumption that it's a large social problem and that therefore it might show up for different groups in different ways. And these ways might require specific approaches. Just off the top of my head, there might be some specific ways the problem expresses itself for men as opposed to for women. We know that a lot of the qualities and skills required to build and maintain meaningful relationships, things like vulnerability, openness to intimacy, emotional labor, emotional self-awareness. These things are often more difficult for men in general because of various ways in which they've been conditioned, and we know that often women are better at making friends, especially later in life, that they have stronger, more diverse support networks. So that's all kind of fair enough, I think, if we were talking about this in a vacuum. But part of the problem with discourse is that so often, especially on the internet, it's not really neutral. It reflects or expresses or camouflages other dynamics, other ideas. So by this point on the internet, the male loneliness epidemic has become mostly a meme, like it's a kind of joke. A lot of times women see the term and they smell that something might be off. For some, there's the presumption of it all, the centering of the male experience. So why isn't there a female loneliness epidemic? What about the loneliness of, say, single mothers or immigrants in a new place speaking in a fourth language, or shift workers who are too tired to socialize? The question of who gets to be lonely or whose loneliness is prioritized in the culture is also a question of who matters, which is ultimately a political question. Critics of the term male loneliness epidemic often sense beneath the quite neutral framing an entitlement or passiveness, a subtext of we need women to make us less lonely through relationships or sex or romance, and they're not playing ball, so now we're upset and we don't know what to do with this upsetness. So you can see this skepticism, this kind of quasi-sneering very easily. Like if you Google male loneliness epidemic, the first result is a Reddit post titled, "The male loneliness epidemic is a self-pitying problem." And the post has a lot of very valid critique, ones that I've seen elsewhere or thought of myself. One of the points the post makes is that if this is a loneliness problem, why is so much of the talk around it focused on women and dating? If you're so lonely, then why aren't you volunteering or making friends with men, making friends with women, getting to know your neighbours, getting involved in groups or unions or societies? And the obvious answer to this is that even when these people use the word loneliness, underneath it there's other things going on. There's a more general pressure for heterosexual relationships to provide so much meaning and intimacy. There's a way that so many men are conditioned to view women as an other, which makes it very hard to form meaningful friendships. There's also the historical positioning of women as nourishers, fixers, emotional problem solvers, in ways that have over time encouraged a kind of internal laziness amongst some of the male population. And of course, if we zoom out a bit into the general shifts in Western politics, especially the turn towards conservatism, the backlash against feminism and many parts of liberalism, it's not unreasonable to detect in the male loneliness epidemic some of that politics of grievance. Why aren't we getting the thing we want? One of the many layers of this tragedy is, of course, that the way out for a lot of these men is through confronting and actually extricating themselves from the ways in which they've been conditioned through patriarchy. Feminists have been writing for decades about how men are ill-served by patriarchy and some of the ways they can at least partially free themselves of it. On top of that, the kind of sectioning off of this problem in gender terms also obscures the ways in which the problem and the solutions are more structural. What would help is probably building more solidarity across the gender lines. One of the big issues in the way that this kind of problem is framed and discussed online is this very urgent historical feeling that it is a panic that is happening right now. It is of the moment and it's not so connected with larger historical forces. So feelings tend to feel so intimate and personal and of the moment to us. But like all things, feelings have histories. They are constructed and expressed and understood through shifting contexts across cultures and societies. So loneliness, like everything else, has a history. If we are able to put ourselves on a longer timeline, we might be able to find other ways of thinking about the problem. In her book, A Biography of Loneliness, The History of an Emotion, British historian Faye Bound-Alberti warns against the assumption of loneliness as a sort of ahistorical, essential part of the human experience, or at least one that transcends specifics like class, time, and place. The book's introduction aligns rising public loneliness panic with the triumph of the neoliberal worldview in the late 1900s and its gradual destruction of community bonds, but places the general phenomenon of what we call loneliness on a much longer historical spectrum. Quote, loneliness in its modern sense emerged as both a term and a recognizable experience around 1800. Soon after, ideas about sociability and secularism became important to the social and political fabric. It was reinforced by the emergence of an all-encompassing ideology of the individual. We do see instances in the English lexicon of the word lonely as far back as the 15 and 1600s. It shows up for the first time in the poetry of Philip Sidney, and probably more well known, it shows up in Milton's Paradise Lost in a description of Satan. In this period, the word was often used as a way of describing certain places of isolation, like forests or deserts, or more generally just experiences of exile, of being made alone. So Satan is the ultimate example of this. He's the prince that gets thrown out of heaven. But the spread of the word lonely and loneliness, and more specifically, loneliness as a recognizable emotional experience for modern people, is bound up in the rise of industrialization and capitalism, mostly from the 1800s onwards. It's kind of built into the modern condition. And the connection between loneliness and industrialization and the manifold changes wrought upon European economies is something Arendt observes in her Origins of Totalitarianism. And in the book, she offers us some very specific and useful definitions of some of these concepts that we've been talking about. Concepts that are often used in fuzzy or intergeneric ways. So for Hannah Arendt, loneliness is extremely important. As the quote at the start of the video suggested, it's one of the things that makes Nazism possible. But what does she actually mean by the word? So let's get specific. At the end of Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt differentiates between three related but distinct experiences: isolation, solitude, and loneliness. For her, isolation isn't just lacking a connection with others, it's more specifically lacking the ability to act politically through connections with others. Isolation is what happens, quote, when the political sphere of men's lives, where they act together in the pursuit of a common goal, is destroyed. Here she's talking about politics in a wider sense, not just like voting for a party, but rather having networks or mechanisms or organizations through which you can unite with people similar to you and act in a common interest. And one way we might view a lot of recent political convulsions is an expression of this appetite for connection, for common purpose. Next, solitude. This is a kind of aloneness, but more specifically, a healthy kind of aloneness. Arendt writes that solitude is a necessary temporary retreat from the immediate world where a person can explore, can think, be creative, use their productive energies. She says, I am by myself, together with myself, and therefore two in one. But this dialogue of the two in one does not lose contact with the world of my fellow men because they are represented in the self with whom I lead the dialogue of thought. So this two in one, this sense of having a strong inner self that you can actually have a dialogue with and can think things through with is key here. Because, quote, solitude can become loneliness. This happens when all by myself I am deserted by my own self. This idea of being deserted or being abandoned is very important in Arendt's text here. I really like this emphasis on the self because I detect sometimes in a lot of common loneliness discourse an element of like accumulation or acquisition, that you just need to collect enough friends or relationships and this will solve the problem. There's often comparatively little focus on the kind of work of the self. And crucially for Arendt, the self isn't the sort of self-optimized, neoliberal, independent island, something set apart from the world, from other people. It's a self that is in dialogue with the world. It's a sort of internalized representation of the world. Yeah, and maybe this sounds a little wonky, but I think I know what Arendt is talking about. I mean, there are times for me personally when I'm on my own, but I am reading something really good or interesting. I'm walking through Berlin, thinking about things, and I feel both, on my own, but also sort of part of a wider thing, a thing that I'm in some way participating in. And this sense of like participation is also something I get through things like art or teaching. So, crucial for the protection against loneliness is not just building strong social relationships, although this is obviously really important, but also the development of a kind of rich, strong, authentic inner self, one informed by and curious about the world at large. This is also often very hard to do because, as Arendt knows, we abandon ourselves all the time, usually because of factors outside of our control. So we're conditioned to think in certain ways, to talk in certain ways. We're forced by material pressures to prioritize like work and security, to sacrifice so much time and energy on things which, if we had any real say in the matter, we probably wouldn't be bothering with. Like I said, yes, sometimes there are times when I'm here living in the city and I feel connected with people, with the world, with myself. There are other times in which this is impossible. And one of the reasons is because sometimes I'm just too tired from work. So if we sit on this idea of labor for a second and we think of Arendt's idea about abandonment or self-abandoning, we could also maybe take a little jump here and think about other similar concepts that might help us, concepts like self-estrangement or alienation. And to understand these a little bit more, we're going to take a little trip to Paris, the left bank, in the summer of 1844, where a young university graduate named Karl is sketching out a few ideas. One of the ideas that the young Marx is working on here, which would find publication many decades later, is what's known as his theory of alienation. The idea of labor or work as an impediment to self-actualization and a contributor to loneliness is there in Marx's thought from the start. So the claim here is that through his participation in labor, the worker is alienated from the product of his labor because he has no personal attachment to it. He's doing it to earn a wage, to pay rent, to survive. And the specifics of what he is doing here are directed by people above him, by the interests of boss or capital. But this alienation, this estrangement, as Mark calls it, spreads. It's not just that the person is alienated from the thing they're making, they are alienated from themselves because they are forced to use their very limited mental, emotional, physical energies in ways that serve not themselves, but systems at large. They become alienated from themselves and then ultimately from each other. One of the consequences of not really knowing yourself is that it makes it very difficult to get to know others. Alienation is known really to probably everyone. Everyone has had to work a job, work a bad job. And beyond the immediate kind of physical or scheduling realities of work, there's also the ways in which market logic has spread, kind of affecting social relations in general, encouraging us in large and small ways not to view each other as brothers or sisters or fellow travelers, fellow sufferers, but rather competition or commodities or a service. Remember, the term loneliness epidemic first made its appearance in the Harvard Business Review, one of the organs of elite American corporate culture. Framed through concerns about workplace morale or productivity, the thesis being that loneliness was bad for business. Well, maybe it's the other way around.